Let's do this. The best thing, I'll make a couple of comments, but in large measure, this is your time. The whole purpose of these forums is to give you all the ability to ask whatever questions you want to ask. I would prefer, you're welcome to make comments as well, and I really welcome that in some measure, but try to make them somewhat constructive and pointed so that we can let people who do want to weigh in and have whatever comments they want to make heard as well. This is a two-way forum, a chance for you to make comments, ask questions, get answers to things that you would like answers to. But thank you for coming, really and truly. Middle of a day, on a weekday, it's not always the easiest time for people to get away from whatever else you might be doing, especially on a beautiful sunny day, so thank you. I'll make just a brief couple of comments and then literally open it up to questions you have. So if you have specific questions, comments, please feel free to ask them. The one thing that I would ask quite literally is to please don't hold off. If you have a question or something that you want to ask, a lot of times what will happen is people will come up afterwards and will say, hey, I wish I could have asked this question, or I wanted to ask this question but didn't know if it was the right forum. This is the right forum. I mean, this is literally, there's no question you have. It is not the right question to ask in this environment. And in fact, if you have a question that you think might be somewhat controversial or maybe complicated or what have you, if it's too big an issue to resolve in the course of a few minutes, we'll say as much, but at least raise it, because if you have the question, chances are someone else might have the same question. So let me just simply say this. The whole point of this, again, is to give you an update on sort of where things are, but also take a pulse from you as to what issues you would like to discuss. Certainly, pensions are topical. I can tell by the way some of you have dressed. This might be important to some of you. It's okay, Stephanie, you can even smile. It's all right. I would say, in all seriousness, this is a topical conversation. It's a big, important conversation today in our Supreme Court. There's much that depends on decisions that are made. We'll talk about that and why this is important. Backing up to the highest level. When I ran for governor, this is, as many of you know, this is the first political job that I've ever had. I didn't study political science. I'd never worked on a campaign. I'd never worked for anybody politically. This is my first political job. There were two things that motivated me to run. Number one was the pension issue. I worked for a long time in the investment management business, managing money for pension systems, public systems and private systems. Companies that are private and states that are public. This state has the worst funded pension system in America. It is going to fail if we don't make structural changes to it. That's a fact. When people get excited by 10% rates of return in the market, that's awesome. But my goodness, if you thought you could bank on that, all of us would do very well in our 401ks. We know for a fact we can't bank on those kind of things year in and year out. So we'll talk about these things during the course of our conversation. The other thing that motivated me to run was our adoption and foster care system. It's completely broken. It's completely broken in this state. It's not unique to our state, sadly. But we have even now 9,500 kids in our foster care system. 2,500 of whom are eligible to be adopted, wanted to be adopted, looking for a forever family. And we're failing these kids, and we have been failing them for generations. These two things are unacceptable. So when I ran a couple years back, 3 years ago, whenever it was now, I ran on what I call a blueprint for a better Kentucky. There were 7 things in that blueprint. I was the only one running that put into writing what it was that I was interested in doing and the reasons for which I was running. And you can still go out, I would encourage you to do it. Go out and look up what it was that we ran on. Google it up. There were 7 things. It's simple. You put bevin blueprint, Better Kentucky, or something like that, and I'm sure it'll come up. There were 7 things on there. They were fiscal in nature. They were economic in nature. I have many thoughts, as do many in this room, on any number of other issues, social and otherwise. And they're important and they matter. But truth be told, if we become financially insolvent as a state, if we're fiscally collapsing as a state, if we can't afford to meet our obligations and pay our bills as a state, those social issues become somewhat moot, sadly. They're still important, they still matter. They still move people, literally and figuratively, to be in a place or not, but they become very secondary to the financial status of the state. Because people also have the ability to move in that regard as well. So those are the 2 reasons. I mean, adoption and foster care and the pensions were the reasons I ran. But the 7 things I put in the blueprint for a better Kentucky are the things that I said, if I'm elected, I'm going to focus on. One of those 7 things One of the primary ones, I think it was the second or third one of the 7, although they weren't ranked in any particular order, was specifically addressing the pension system. Calling attention to the fact, because while there were 7 bullet points, there were 12 pages of detail behind them. They were simple. Even that wasn't overly complicated. You go back, look it up, read it. Understand that when I was elected saying that we're going to address the very same things that we have been addressing. And we won 106 out of 120 counties. There's a lot of people who say, well, you know, not enough people voted. I'm telling you, a lot more people voted in that election than did in the previous elections. Got more votes than the previous governor ever got, which is neither here nor there. In an off-year election cycle, not a lot of people do vote. I would encourage you to do something about it. I don't care what side of the political aisle you're on. Vote. It's the greatest privilege we have. I used to be an active duty Army officer. A number of you have perhaps served in the military. I served with guys who are dead. Guys my age whose kids have grown up without a father. Shame on all of us if we don't vote. A lot of people, 1.5 million people have given their lives in uniform. Since the inception of this nation, 1.5 million people have died in this nation's uniform. To give us the privilege to be able to gather here, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, the ability to go to the ballot box, the ability to have a government that truly is of and by and for the people. This is an extraordinary gift that we have. Extraordinary gift. And even now there are people in uniform in this room. Others who have worn this nation's uniform, either in the military or in some kind of a civil enforcement role, who protect and serve us day in and day out. We have an obligation to vote. We have an obligation to be engaged. We truly do. To go back and look at these 7 points and look at these issues. Every one of them was something that I was told, whatever you do, don't talk about that during a campaign. Whatever you do, don't write these things down. Nobody gets elected saying they're going to tackle the pension problem. It's not popular. Nobody gets elected saying they're going to talk about right to work and bring that to this state. Nobody's going to get elected talking about school choice or tax modernization or cutting regulation. Those were 5 of the 7 points right there. Every one of them considered a third rail. Every one of them considered the kiss of death. Don't go there. Nobody ever talks about that during your campaign. Maybe once you're elected, you might, if you think you have the momentum, go ahead and tackle these things. Nonsense. We've been treated like a bunch of fools for a long time in this state as taxpayers and as voters. We have. By people in both parties. And we've been fed a bill of goods from a lot of people for a long time. And people have lied to us time and time and time again about a variety of things, not the least of which is the tenuous nature of this pension system. We'll talk about that during the course of our hour together. But the reason I put these things out there in writing, the reason I talked about them in every debate, the reason I talked about them during the campaign in every one of these forums that I had like this one, is because they needed to be addressed. Because we're not fools, and we shouldn't be treated like we are. And these people who have kicked these cans and kicked these cans and kicked these cans down the road over and over and over again have not been shooting straight with us. And the whole point in putting them out there was to say that if in fact we are capable of, and I believed we were, and we're proving that we are, capable of having adult level conversations like adults and dealing with hard decisions, that we can make Kentucky better, period. Absolutely convinced of that. And so we are tackling a lot of things that are hard, they're painful, they're difficult to understand, they're unpleasant to many. And the reality is nobody likes change. Nobody. Nobody. Inside government, outside government, inside your family, inside your office environment, your churches, your civic clubs, whatever the case might be, there's no organization or group, small or large, that you're a part of that likes change. I would bet no. Human beings don't like it. But if you keep kicking cans down the road and lying about things and hiding things and not dealing with the unpleasant facts in the room, nothing gets better. So this is what we've been doing from the beginning. And we have made transformative change. At the end of the day, everything we want, everything. You could care about law enforcement, you could care about education, you could care about infrastructure, roads, bridges, and whatever the case might be. These are fundamental principles of what government is supposed to provide to us. It is. Those 3, among others, are the 3 that people most expect and should to be paid for and addressed out of their tax dollars. But every one of those 3, and everything else we might need or want, government to provide can only be paid for with what? What pays for all of it? Taxpayers. Exactly. It's the taxpayers. And guess what? In a free market world, in a world where people can live in this state or the next state down or the next state up or the next state over or across the country or outside of the country, where people have free choice and how blessed we are to live in a nation where people do, the kind of tax policy and whether we address our problems or not determines how many people live here. You go back to World War II. It wasn't that long ago. There's people in this room that were alive when World War II was underway. You go back to the 1940s. The populations of Tennessee, Indiana, and Kentucky were almost the same. We were slightly larger than one of them, slightly smaller than the other, but the truth be told, in 1940, we were all roughly the same size. And indeed, geographically, we're all the same size. If you looked at all the states ranked in order of land mass, we're right in between the two of them, and the three of us are in sequential order in the rank from 50 to 1. So we're very similar to them. Geographically, we're similar. Demographically, we're similar. A lot of similarities. 75 years ago, we were populationally similar. Both those states now have 2 to 2.5 million more people than we do. Why? Because we have been stuck with antiquated policies, outdated tax policies, outdated labor policies, outdated approaches to any number of things. Will Rogers once noted very astutely, the cowboy poet, again, people of a certain generation know who he is, others maybe not. But he was once well quoted by many people, and he was a savvy fellow. He said, even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. Arguably, that's the best we could say. For those who have felt, well, we're on the right track, let's just keep doing it. While others have run over the top of us, we have sat still. How is it possible? We've got better weather, better geography, better location, better seasonality, better quality of life, lower electricity costs than either of those two states I just mentioned. We've got more arable land. We have less extremes in the winter and less extremes in the summer. We have less cataclysmic events that happen meteorologically as it relates to storm activity, etc. than either of those states. And they border us. And they each have 2 million plus people more than us. How is this possible? Could you imagine if we had 2 million more people in this state? Seriously. If we had 2 million more people in Kentucky and just 30 or 40% of them pay taxes, which is a conservative but reasonable estimation of how many would, could you imagine 600,000 or 800,000 more taxpayers? Every single thing you care about, every single thing that has been getting cut for years and that we would like to have more money in, would be getting more money. Education, law enforcement, infrastructure, all the above. We would have no lack of ability to pay for the things we want if we had another 500,000 plus taxpayers. But why is it that they're going to these states and others and not this one? Why is it that we've been growing incrementally while those around us over the last 75 years have not been growing as slow? Because they have gotten their house in order and they have addressed things that are hard, that are change agents. And they've made changes that have made their states more attractive. And in a world where people have choices, and if you don't believe it, go down to the Fort Campbell community. Which side of the state line do people live on? How many of you all have ever been at Fort Campbell? Maybe stationed, a number of you. Where does everybody live? They live in Clarksville. They live on the other side. Why? Because it's more advantageous to them. Truth be told, it's no prettier on that side. They don't have more amenities. It's actually a little nicer on our side. It really is. In terms of the pure geography and the beauty of the landscape. But people go where their wallet incentivizes them to go. Capital goes where their wallet incentivizes it to go. Companies invest where there's an incentive for them to come. Where their employees are not overly taxed, where they are not overly taxed. I did one of these town hall forums the other day up in Harrison County. The largest employer in that county is a company called 3M. Some of you may know this, you may not. If not, you'll learn a little anecdote for the day. All the Post-it notes that are made in Kentucky. Did you know that? 94 billion Post-it notes are made in Kentucky every year in Harrison County. And this plant, which pays tens of millions of dollars into the tax system, it is far and away the largest supporter of public education in that community. I had people stand up who were retired from a particular public service venue that had been the beneficiaries of that, who stood up, and while the manager of that plant was in the room, and many people who worked for that company or are retired from that company, and said these people aren't paying their fair share. They need to pay more money. If this company would just pay more money, we'd have more money for all the things we want. I mean, really? You hear enough of that in your company? In a world where people have the ability to move? People move. They do it all the time. They may move to another state, like Toyota did, from Erlanger to Texas. Or they may move, like Fruit of the Loom did, from Jamestown to Guatemala, wherever they went. The reality is people can move, and they do move. And the policies of a state matter. Before we take questions, a couple things that are important to understand. I want to talk about the pension system. And I'm just going to anticipate that this will be a question people care about. We have the worst funded pension system in America. How many of you are currently retired as a state worker or are working currently expecting at some point to draw a pension from the state? A lot of you. Outstanding. It's a little bit like a wedding, and mostly on one side. I guess I don't know if it's the bride's or the groom's side. But the point is, on both sides, there's a lot of folks. Think about this. How does a defined benefit plan work? A defined benefit plan depends on people paying into it to make it work. That's a fact. This system is broken, and it has been for a long time. When these systems were set up, the way it worked is that in order for someone to be able to retire, you needed people down here at the bottom. And indeed, 75 plus years ago, the 30s and 40s, when these systems were being put into place, for every retiree, there were 7, 8, 9 workers down here at the bottom. That's the way it was. That's the way it has always been when they've been healthy and well-funded. But what has changed over time? Demographic reality has changed over time. Think about this. People say, well, no, I put in, I'm just getting my own money back. No, you're not. That's not how it works. And we'll go through that in a moment. And I'll give for you an example of an understanding of why the system is broken. Because we've made a lot of promises that nobody who made them could have the ability to keep. People have been lied to for a long time. We'll talk about that. But think about this. For people who think, well, the system works because I'm getting my own money back in a DB plan, no, you're not. How did the first people ever retire? How did the first people retire out of a DB plan if that was the case? They didn't. The very first people to get pensions for life. They didn't work under that pension system for 20, 30, 40 years. They didn't. They maybe worked for 1, 2, 3 years, heck, maybe not even. But then they retired, and the 7, 8, 9 people down here paid that benefit to them. Hence the name defined benefit. It was that benefit that was paid by the people down here that were putting into the system, and it worked. Because demographically, in the baby boomers coming of age, there were many workers and very few retirees. And it worked great. When there were 7, 8, 9. Then it was 4, 5, 6. Still worked, not as well. 3, 4, 5. 2, 3, 4. 1. Less than 1. There are more retired workers in Kentucky from the state pension plans than there are active workers. And that is never going to reverse in our lifetimes, probably ever. It's not. How does a system that is designed to work like this work when it's upside down? It's down a wedge. It is upside down. It is driving itself into the ground. That is a hard and painful reality, but this has been coming for the last 20 plus years. We've seen it, and people have ignored it. And the irony is people that are protesting what we're doing, which is talking about it, and are upset about that, have spent millions of dollars supporting the very people who have never, ever even funded the minimally required, actuarially required contribution. The bare minimum that has been told to us by accountants to be put in to keep the system from bleeding out. My predecessor and the one before that, and that represents two different parties, never fully funded that pension system once, not once. My predecessor in some years didn't even do it to 50% of the bare minimum required to keep it from falling farther in the hole. And yet people spent millions of dollars out of teachers' union dues and other dues.
No, that's not true.
That is true.
It is not
Running
true.
ads to support people in a single party, the very party that has been lying to people. If you audit your funds, I'm not going to get in a big debate with you, but you know where the money's going. You know where they've gone. The point is the system is broken. The system is broken. And so let's talk about this for a minute. People say, well, we put our money in, we want to get our money out. Let's just say you're a state employee. But it doesn't matter what you did. You taught for the state, you worked for 30 years then. Let's just say, to make the math simple, you earned on average $50,000 a year. I know the average person doesn't, although some may now. They didn't start out that way. But let's just do this. You can dial it up or down based on whether you made more or less. But if you're an average worker, and just to put it in perspective, if you talk about teachers, the average teacher in Kentucky, as of last week, I checked the latest numbers, who has taught for 30 years or more and is retired. So these are people who have paid a lot of dues, have taught a lot of children, have served our communities and made them better. They put a lot in, including their dollars, their contributions. They've hit every metric of ways that they could maximize their return, and good for them. That's the way the system works, and they should. The average teacher in Kentucky right now, not counting COLAs and adjustments that will be made just today, who's taught for 30 years or more and is retired, makes $57,340 a year in retirement. $57,340 a year, plus benefits like health care that come at cost to the taxpayers that are not included in that. So that's a decent sum of money. So let's just think about that for a minute. But let's just say, on average, they only make $40,000. They worked for 30 years, made an average of $50,000. That's $50,000 a year. Let's say during the course of that time, they paid in 13% of what they made, which again is, while it's not always been the case, is currently about the case of what people pay in. It's a big chunk of their paycheck, big chunk. 13%. 13% of $50,000, $6,500 a year. So they're putting in $6,500 a year in this scenario that we're discussing for 30 years. 6,500 times 30 is $195,000. Okay? $195,000. They taught for 30 years. They worked on the roads for 30 years. They were a social worker for 30 years. Whatever it is that they did. Let's say now in retirement, they pulled out $40,000. Not the 57, not even 50 that they made. Let's just say on average about 40,000, which is closer to the kind of numbers that people make regardless of what they did for 30 years. But your average person who worked for anything for 30 years tends to make more than that, but let's just say it's 40. Over the course of 30 years, they put in $195,000. They retire at the age of, say, 52. They say they started at 22, they taught 30 years, they worked on the roads 30 years, they were a social worker 30 years, whatever. They're now 52 years old and they're retired. The odds are remarkably high that they can live to be 92 years old. They really are. There's 3 times as many people in their 90s as there were just a generation ago, and that's continuing. Every one of us in this room has pretty darn good odds of getting to 90 plus years old. We just do. We're blessed to be in that kind of a world. Not all of us will, but it's good. But let's just say you retire at 52, you work to be 92 years old, or to live to be 92 years old. And you're making $40,000 a year in retirement. You may have a COLA, you may not. You're getting health care on top of it. We're not even talking about health care. We're talking about just the salary that you get in retirement. So for 40 years, from 52 to 92, you're getting $40,000 a year. That's $1.6 million. You saved $195,000, you get out 1.6. Do the math on that. Anybody, explain to me how this works over the long term when there are fewer people working than there are retired. It's impossible. It is absolutely, financially, statistically, actuarially impossible. It has been for many, many years. We've known this. But we have lied to people. People have not shot straight. People celebrate the fact that just this year, certain plans had returns of 10.2, 10.3%, whatever it was, over 10%. That's great. That's awesome. Anybody remember 2008, 2009? What kind of rate of return did you get then? What about the year after that? What about that entire decade when you had 3 positive rates of return in an entire 10-year period? You can't crow and assume, well, we got 10%, so therefore we're doing great, we're going to get 10% for the next 20, 30 years. That's nonsense. It doesn't work that way. You can't bank on that. These systems are broken. The best funded plan we have is the county employees retirement system, which some of you are a part of. It's about 60% funded. And that's using assumed rates of return that we frankly have not met over time, but let's just say they're fair and accurate. It's about 60% funded. In the private sector, there's something called the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, PBGC. For private sector companies, XYZ company, ABC company, what have you, if they have a pension plan that falls below 80% funding, 80%, the PBGC, by law, steps in, seizes that plan, shuts it down, and pays people who are in that plan, regardless of what they were promised, maybe 15 cents on the dollar if they're likely, if they're lucky, no more than that. They're going to get about 15 cents on the dollar, the plan is then dispersed, and that's the end. And you've seen this happen not only in the private sector, time and time again, you've seen it happen with cities. In the case of Detroit, most famously in recent years, San Bernardino, other places like this, we've seen it happen. Why? Because the promises that were made can't be backed up by the actual reality of the money, or the lack thereof. This is the hard reality of what we are facing. Now bear in mind, the PBGC steps in at 80% funding or less. By the time you get down to 60, 65, they've already been shut down and eliminated. We don't have a single plan in Kentucky even close to being 80% funded. And I hear from people who are in plans that have 53, 4, 5% funding, and they say, hey, we're not as bad as the KDRS non-hazardous plan. Look, they're only 16% funded. Our largest plan, the one that has the most employees in it, the KDRS non-hazardous plan, hundreds of thousands of people expecting a paycheck. People still in there earning one and expecting to get it in retirement. 16% funded, 1/6. It's broke. It's insolvent. It is a badly funded checking account at this point. They pay out far more, multiples more every year in benefits than they take in, and they now have more retirees than workers. It's over. It cannot be maintained by people paying in. You can pay in 100% of what you make, and you can't be earning 40, save for your own retirement, and pay for someone who's getting 40 in retirement that's not working. It doesn't work. But again, we don't have a single plan that's even 65% funded. They would have all been shut down. And when I hear people say, hey, we're 53, 4, 5% funded, you know who else was 55% funded less than 10 years ago? The KDRS non-hazardous plan. That's who. Because once the bleed starts, it's over. It wasn't just this year that we had a good rate of return. Last year the markets were up big too. One of our plans had a 15% rate of return. It was a teacher plan, 15% rate of return, I believe, last year. So we've had 2 good years in a row. Guess what happened? They had a 15% rate of return in the markets. But how much did the actual amount of money that was in there grow after distributions were made to obligations that have already been promised to people? 2%. Took in 15%, but only grew by 2. What does that tell you? We're bleeding out. We're bleeding out. If we could guarantee that we get better than 13% a year, we can stay flat. But if you take in 15 and you only have, if you take in $15 and only 2 of them are left at the end of the year, that tells you 13 went somewhere. Where did they go? They went to fulfill promises that have been made to people. And those promises should be kept. We have a legal and a moral obligation to pay the promises that have been made. Whether they should have been made, whether they can afford to be made, is irrelevant, unless we truly run out of money. Hence the whole purpose behind saving the system. And now the court case that is being heard today by the Supreme Court is whether or not the legislature, as opposed to the judges or the Attorney General or whoever else would want to have the authority of the legislature, whether the legislature has the ability to state that for people not even in the system yet, people not even employed by the state, do we have the ability to have a different savings structure, a different retirement structure, a different pension structure for those folks than we do for people already in the system? Our Attorney General doesn't think we should. Certain other people and interest groups don't think we should. Let me tell you right now, as an absolute statistical matter of fact, if we promise people not get employed by the state, the same thing we promise to those of you who are or who used to be, you are guaranteeing not only will they not get what they think is coming, those not yet employed, nor will the people currently working, and nor will almost all of you that are retired unless you're going to pass away in the very next few years. That is a hard, painful reality. And if you want to lie to people and just keep foisting on them the belief that this money is magically going to appear when we see it bleeding out. Less than 20 years ago, all these plans were fully funded in terms of the amount that was owed to the existing retirees at that time. People say find funding first. If we had only funded the ARC, well, we never did, number one, and where was the outrage then? Where were the protests then? They were non-existent. Money was paid to support the people that were underfunding. Shame on anyone involved in that. But it is what it is. But if it were simply a function of finding the funding first, then you know what plan would be 100% funded right now? Because they put in the actuarially required contribution by law every single year for the last 20 years, since they were fully funded. The CERS plan. CERS would be fully funded if it was simply a function of putting in the ARC. The ARC, the actuarially required contribution, that people think if we had only done that, which we didn't, but if we had only done that, we'd all be good. We wouldn't. That is 16% of the underfunded status, of every dollar we owe that we don't have. And it's tens and tens of billions, 60 billion conservatively. That's using the current assumed rates of return, which historically on average we've not gotten, but just using those assumed rates of return, we owe about $62 billion right now. But for every one of those $62 billion, only 16 cents of each dollar is because the funding was not put in. What about the other 84%? The other 84% is driven by what we talked about earlier. The fact that with each passing retiree, there wasn't somebody's plural or even somebody singular coming in to take their place and pay into the system. Our teachers right now, 38% of our teachers are eligible to retire. 38%. We don't have a need based on our current population to replace them with 38% new ones. If they were to all retire, there might be. But what drives population growth is the same thing that drives the growth for more law enforcement, more teachers, more social workers, more roads being plowed, more roads and bridges being built. It's more people. And guess what those people do? They pay taxes. It's all connected. People can get mad and they can be upset with the message or the messenger, but I'm telling you, the system is broken. It is the worst funded system in America. Nobody contests that. Nobody contests that. It is the worst, most underfunded system in America. And we can ignore it. We can pretend the money's going to be there, but it's not. I'm sorry?
You've been talking ahead.
I have been. That is really the purpose of this, ma'am.
But
So I'll tell you what. Are there questions about that or other things that you would like to ask? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. It's not about pensions, okay?
Good, perfect.
My question is, I'm a retired state employee and a retired EKU professor. I'm wondering how it can be justified that your friend, Mr. Grindle, got a raise of $215,000 at the time that state employees have not gotten an across-the-board raise since 2015. Yeah.
So, let me ask you a question.
Wait a second. And the effect that that has on the morale of your employees.
Sure. The question is about the CIO of this state who makes $375,000 a year, is what he's paid. And the question is, what effect does that have on morale? I'll repeat every question. I assume you heard it, but I'll repeat it anyway. What effect does that have on morale? This is asked by somebody who has, you have 2 pensions from the state? Yes. Okay. What effect do you think that has on the morale of the 90-something percent? I will. But understand this. All these things, all of them, come at a cost. Dr. Grindle earns $375,000. There are 30-some thousand employees in the state. We have a budget of tens of billions of dollars. It's bigger than some Fortune 500 companies. The size of this state, we have a $500 to $600 million technology budget in this state. So about $500 million plus every year that we pay on technology. The average CIO for a similarly sized company in the private sector makes more than $500,000. No, it isn't. It sure isn't. But understand this. If you want confidence, you know what we've had in the past? So let me finish answering the question, and then I'll come to your point. This isn't the private sector, you're right. Because if it was, we couldn't afford him for $375,000. The base pay for a CIO, listen, bear with me just again, let me answer and then we can ask follow-up questions. The base pay for a CIO in a Fortune 500 company is over $500,000. With bonuses, incentive comp, well over $1 million a year. He's working for a third of what he could make. Let me tell you about this individual. I'm asked by people.
I have a question.
Yes,
please answer my question. It deals with this.
Okay,
You said that we are the poorest state and that we don't have people coming in. Then how can you justify that? Because we are not a Fortune 500 company. We are a very small, poor state, and you gave him $375,000. Please explain that.
Okay, but here's the thing. I didn't say we're the poorest state. I said we have the worst funded pension system in America. Two very different things. But let me understand this. Listen, what did we have the previous individual? You know how many dollars we have spent? How many of you have ever worked in the IT world at all, or know a little bit about it? Okay, how many of you remember programming languages called Fortran and COBOL? Some of you remember. Okay, these are a bit antiquated. They're dinosaur languages in some respects. We had dozens of people who work for this state that we pay hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to in combination. Probably more than $1 million if you look at all of them combined. Whose sole job is to program in Fortran and COBOL so that our mainframe computers can still do what we needed to do to keep Kentucky going. That's what we've been paying for. Because we've been taking the cheaper route, and we've chosen people who will work at a government-related salary, even if they're not competent, even if they don't know what they're doing. The idea that we have mainframe computers, half the size of this room, that are running things that your phone has more computing power than that does, and we are paying dozens of people to maintain this antique, is absurd. You should be outraged. Let me tell you about Dr. Grindle. Dr. Grindle has 2 master's degrees and a PhD in information systems. I hear people say he's the highest paid CIO in America for a state. That's true, because there's not another state CIO in America that even has close to his qualifications. The fact that he's willing to work here is good for us. This man, some of you remember the Gulf War. During the Gulf War, he ran the entire Third Army's network for all of the U.S. and its allies. This is a guy who was a professor, a tenured faculty member at the Army War College, teaching cyber and network securities to generals. So you're saying that his education is valuable? I'm saying his education, his qualifications. Of course it is. Of course it is. And that may be humorous, but it's a fact. So my point is this. He's working for a fraction of what he could make elsewhere. So again, and in every instance, what does the market do? The market supports what the market can bear. It does. That's the reality of it. Think about this in the private sector.
It's not private sector.
It isn't, but it's all paid for by the private sector. It is. It is. You're shocked at that. All the money. That's what taxpayer money comes from in the private sector. All the money, 100% of it, whether it's going to a salary or a retirement system or anything, all comes from people in the private sector who earn that money and pay taxes on it. 100%. There's 3 questions here. I'm going to go to them in order. You had a question, you had a question, you had a question, and you had a question.
Thank you, Governor Bevin. My name is Delvin Oxofeva. I'm a school teacher in Fayette County. I'm not here for the pension, sorry guys. What I am here is for school safety. I've asked this question to KEA and to other folks, this basic question. Why is one child's right to an education more important than another child's right to safety? Amen. Just yesterday, my principal got hit by a student who has a constant documented history of violence against staff, violence against students. This student, his only purpose in school is to harass other students. It keeps them from learning. It keeps teachers from teaching. But yet and still, he somehow seemed to be protected by his special ed label. I'm wondering if we just predict out and we think about teachers coming into the field, why do teachers want to come into the field knowing that they're going to be punching bags. What can you do to help protect teachers in the classroom, Governor Bevin?
We can start shooting straight with people about things exactly like this. We can start being realistic and stop putting everything in a one-size-fits-all category. We can start investing more in behavioral health, which is something we've ignored at every level in this state. Medicare, Medicaid, we've spent on average less than 1% of Medicaid dollars in this state, and we're like many other states on helping behavioral health issues. And what this young individual is, who I don't know anything about, from what you described, I guarantee the source of a lot of this is a behavioral health issue, probably that has even been identified, some of which may not have been identified, but is not being addressed, clearly. And so it should not be whether it's a teacher, a principal, another student. Their safety should not be getting compromised. We should not have rules that protect one or two bad actors at the expense of the whole. We shouldn't. And it's not just in our schools. It's everywhere else in society as well. My gracious, ask the people in our law enforcement, how many times do you pick up the same people over and over and over again because there's exceptions and loopholes and reasons why you can't hold them accountable? The sad reality is it exists. So what's being done for the first time? We have a Board of Education that's talking about this honestly and frankly. Very honestly and frankly. And there are some that are very offended at the idea that they are, but it's good that they are. So these topics of conversation are being discussed even now. We have a Commissioner of Education who is passionate about this. If you've watched what has been happening in Jefferson County, here in Fayette County, Jefferson County has dealt with some of the very same things. Marty Polio, who's the new superintendent there, has been here a year and some change now. It's solid. He came in from one of the most successful public high schools as the principal, had a good gig, could have ridden that out, chose to come in and try to be part of the solution because he was concerned about the very things that you've addressed. So too is Wayne Lewis, Dr. Lewis, who's the Commissioner of Education. They literally have put together a plan that has 3 primary points. One of them is dealing with behavioral issues, not only how they're addressed in the schools and by whom, and what is the responsibility to the whole and not just to the individual. That's one of the 3 primary things that is changing the way that county, the largest county with 110,000 public school students in it, is addressing this. And the same will be applied to Fayette County, the second largest, and every other one after that. So it is coming. Not soon enough, should have come a long time ago. But your point is well taken, and I appreciate you raising it. There was a question here. Yes, sir?
I have an exam in 30 minutes.
Okay, I'll tell you what, if you don't mind, sir, go ahead, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, my name is Casey Riddle. I'm a student at Eastern, and I actually got permission from my professor to miss class to come to this, and I have an exam in like 30 minutes, so thanks for taking my question.
We'll be quick so you can cram at the last minute.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I do want to say, before I get to my question, I think it was a little disrespectful of our time that you took 30 minutes speaking when you said you were going to make a few short comments and then let us ask our questions, but that's besides the point. So I'm the Chief of Staff for the Student Government Association at Eastern, and a big problem we've been facing in the past year to 2 years is obviously cuts to higher education, and that's been a big issue we've been facing all across the board at Eastern. So if you take for granted the fact that higher education is an asset to society in practically every way imaginable, I just want to know your thoughts on what you think the future of higher education in Kentucky is going to look like, and if you could just give me your thoughts about that and speak a few words.
Yeah, your point is well taken. Cuts have been made for every one of the last 10 years, at least, maybe 12 years or more now. That every single year, there has been less, at least proportionally, than there was in the year before for post-secondary education, which is what you're talking about. It's still about $1 billion of taxpayer monies every year that are put into post-secondary education. Some going to Eastern, some to our other public 4- and 2-year institutions. The question is, what do I think the future looks like? The future looks like us getting, as the people funding it, which is all of us, a return on that so that people exactly like you get the benefit from it. So in other words, we as a state are moving right now, and we're the only state in America doing this, that in the next 3 years, we're going to phase into 100% outcomes-based funding. No longer will schools get money just based on the fact that they got it before. The same amount of money is going to be out there, but it's going to go to schools based on outcomes. So if you as a student, the fact that you are here, the fact that you're engaged, that you're articulate, that you are informed, that you got permission to miss the one class, which, with all due respect to you, and I appreciate that, I probably, had I been you, wouldn't have even thought to ask when I was your age, so kudos to you. The fact that you know you have an exam coming up and that you're thinking about that and you want to go knock that out, you're exactly the kind of person that we should make sure we're getting a return on that money for. And so if you graduated in 4 years because your school, your teachers, your guidance counselor are focused like a laser on helping you graduate as expeditiously as possible, who wins? You win. So too does the school, so too does society, so too does anybody else who may be helping you with assistance. Maybe you're doing it like I did, 100% on your own. But no matter who's paying for it, that person or persons benefit from you moving through quickly. Outcomes-based funding incentivizes the university to care more about that than you just being enrolled as a student, and which is a possible concern if they're not focused. So outcomes-based funding says that how many people have what's the graduation rate? What's the progress toward graduation? How employable are you? What is the kind of debt you have when you graduate? What are the conditions of that debt? We have more student loan debt in America now than we have credit card debt. Crazy. We've crushed your generation. Crushed you with debt. It's absolutely reprehensible. And so it's important for us to understand my vision. I have 9 children. They're 19 down to 8. Your concern is a big concern of mine times 9. I care about this as well. And the fact of the matter is, it's interesting, I hear people laugh, which is shocking to me, that you would laugh at the idea that somebody cares about their children. But I do. And so here's, let me say this. I'm not even sure what the disconnect is as to what the reasons you would or wouldn't care about your kids' education. But I will say this. I'm just saying, but don't mock and ridicule the idea that someone cares about their children. That's all I'm asking. So let me say this, man. The future looks like getting a return on the money we invest. In outcomes-based funding will incentivize universities like Eastern to make sure they spend the money to help you move through as effectively, efficiently, and as productively as you can, so that you can study. And guess what? They will have to cut programs, of course. Of course they will. Because when you have a program, let's just say, and I'll pick the topic, it doesn't matter. But if you have a program that has 10 or 12 tenured faculty members and they're teaching 8 students, and that is a real reality in some of our students, then that is one that those university presidents and boards of trustees have to say, is this the best use of these resources? Or could they be poured into, well, I don't know what it is it you're studying?
I study political science and communications.
Political science and communications. There's a lot of possibilities of places you might go and do things with that. Less so for certain other things you might have chosen to study. So what the boards are going to have to, we can be upset about it, but the reality is boards and presidents are going to have to make decisions based on making sure they get outcomes for the money they invest. So my vision is that we will not only spend the money more wisely, but that as we create an economy in which more people come here than they're going to other states, and we have more taxpayers, we'll have more money to put more money in.
And that starts with
There's no individual anywhere, no governor, no legislature anywhere that doesn't want to have more money for law enforcement, education, and infrastructure. Those are the things that will, you're right, make us better. Not only relative to who we are now, but also compared to other states against whom we're competing. So the key is more money and better spending. That's what the future looks like if we want this thing to continue to grow. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Final. This doesn't have anything to do with the teachers or anything. This has to do with your new service tax. Okay. I'm a business here in Madison County, and I'm a general contractor. I have a lot of subs that come in, plumbers, excavators, concrete guys, and such. I cannot hand them a resale certificate because they have to charge me tax. Then I have to turn around, take that number, put a sales tax on that, and pass that through to the customer. Okay? My question is, at what point is too much tax too much tax? Because at the end of the day, my customers are paying about 12.7% taxes from a local business, whereas if you put a caveat in there, if it comes from out of state, oh, that's good, you're not paying. So you're unfairly setting the playing field for out-of-state companies to come in and take work away from local businesses such as myself.
You're talking about the taxes, literally, this just went into effect in July.
Hey, and that's the first part. The second part is, I've contacted the Department of Revenue. They said, okay, how do I pay the taxes? They have no clue. I saved the emails, they're on my phone. That's the reason why I had my phone with me.
Sure.
They had no direction from your office. So I knew the 89th District Representative Rock Oval. So I've been robbed yard for years. I said, Rob, how do I pay the taxes? I mean, I don't want to be in trouble. Mike, nobody knows. It's the worst written law on the books. And I said, who was behind it? He said, you were.
Let me tell you something, that's not true. Because
Well,
I vetoed it.
can you say a little bit louder?
I vetoed it. I
It's the
vetoed
same
that
sales
bill.
tax that I'm going to pay at the end of the month. You
I
think
vetoed that bill.
It's a law.
Ask Rob, did he vote to override the veto? Because the legislature picks, they write that. Understand this, it's important for people to understand how laws come into existence. They're not written by any one individual, certainly not the governor. The governor doesn't even get to vote on a law. The only thing I get to do is veto something that, like you, I think is not well written and not well constructed. That bill hit my desk, I vetoed it. The legislature voted to override my veto.
Okay, and
And I don't know how Rob voted, but I will check.
I know exactly that.
Did he vote to override?
He voted for the override because he said that your office
Well, that's
puts
what you should be
force
upset.
on their office to either vote for the override or you guys are going to shut the state government down. Is
That
that
doesn't
true?
even make sense. Why would I ask him to vote to override?
I don't know.
I had already voted against it. I got one vote. I voted to override. I voted to veto it.
So you
The
think it's,
legislature voted to override.
so I guess.
So what he's telling you, if that's really what he told
That's
you,
exactly.
it
And
makes,
emails, would you like to see it?
then it's a straight up lie. Because it doesn't make any sense. Why would I veto something and then strong arm somebody to override it?
I have no idea.
It makes no sense at all.
I'm saying everything, just me, you asked me that
It
question.
makes no sense.
Okay.
And he's not
So what are you
sure.
going to do to fix this disaster?
Well, the Department of Revenue, somebody else mentioned this a moment ago, the reality is, it is a mess.
Well,
Because
how
it
do we
was not
fix it?
thoughtfully done. We are in the process right now of trying to fix it. I had this conversation with people in the House and the Senate. Before I vetoed it, I told them, if in fact you pass this, I'm going to veto it for the following
Well, the
reasons.
question is, I have customers that have accounts.
Agreed.
Do I pay taxes on money that I don't have
It
yet?
is a mess. Nothing you're saying is wrong.
And so I'm
Exactly
absolutely
right.
accurate.
Yes. The part about it being confusing and you not even knowing who you're supposed to bill or who's supposed to pay tax on what.
That's right.
It is absolutely not definitive, no question about it. It's not clear. That's why I vetoed it.
Okay.
It is a mess. It does need to be fixed. The only people that can fix it are the people who passed it, the legislature. I can't do it. My Department of Revenue cannot do it. The legislature, your elected officials, your representatives,
We'll get rid of it
and your
for sure.
senators, they are the only people that can do it. They're the only ones.
There you go.
So it's important. So interesting, Rob,
Yeah.
you might want to think about this. I mean, really, every race does matter. It does.
So I mean, I guess.
Hang on one second. There was a question here and then over here, sir.
Yeah, my name is Aiden Reese, and I live here in Richmond. My mom is a teacher, and she has been my entire life. She struggled to feed us as we grew up or do anything for herself because of the low wages that she made, even though she dedicated her entire life to teaching. And seeing how you feel about the entire situation, as well as the aggression that I've seen in here today, I would just want to know, like, does it suck to know that you're not going to ever get reelected?
I'm glad you videotaped that because it'll be enjoyable to show that around. But the presumption of that is a little bit odd. Number one, what do you know about my life and my family?
I only know what you make public.
Here's what I'll tell you. My mother's mother was a single mother. My grandfather I didn't know. My mother's dad died when she was a young girl. And she and her younger sister were raised by a single school teacher who was a public school teacher like your mom her entire life. The only retirement system she ever had, the only savings she had, the only income confidence she had when she did retire was her public teacher pension system. It's one of the reasons I'm as passionate as I am about actually saving it and disregarding all of the emotion and looking at the facts, because the facts matter.
Then why did you come
My
to the
father was a public school teacher. Two of my siblings were public school teachers. One of them is still a fourth grade school teacher. I've been surrounded for generations by people exactly like your mom. I understand it. It's why I'm fighting to save this system. It's why in my blueprint for a better Kentucky, I put it as one of my top 7 priorities. It's why, despite all the people who don't want to talk about it and pretend that it's fine, I'm not doing that, because that would be continuing to perpetuate a lie.
But why
It's
not open
important
the
to
doors
say
for
that.
people to want to talk about it and be friendly with people instead of coming where you make us feel like you're already against us and that we have to be aggressive back.
But I'm telling you, we're talking in this case, Stephanie, how many times have you and I had meetings? Twice. How many times did you personally sit down and meet with the previous governor? Be honest. Lots. You sat down face to face and met with the previous governor?
Sure,
Yes,
absolutely.
dozens.
And what did you talk about as it related to the pension system?
All the time, we asked for full funding, and never got it.
Never
I
got
said
it.
publicly that you're the first governor to do that, and all we ask for is you to fully fund it, to give it a chance, because everybody talks about the system when there's actually a system.
Understood. No, there are. There's 8 different pension plans. We've talked about the difference between funding status and some of them. The most well-funded, 60% roughly, worst funded, 16%. So the reality is, again, people will decide with respect to who votes for who and who gets elected to what. People will decide. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about this. Is that this is a free world in which people can vote for whoever they want. Are you a registered voter?
I am.
Did you vote last time?
I did.
Good. I hope you vote again. I really do. And I hope you encourage people to vote.
I
Seriously.
do. I'm actually part of Results, a group that works towards anti-poverty legislation and making sure that young people and old people and all people, both sides of the party, are involved in making our voices heard. That way we know what we want instead of the Kentucky voter turnout that we saw where, yeah, we did have more people that came out and vote, but it was mostly one party. So that means that one party really wasn't involved, which, yeah, that party's bad, you know, and I'm not going to say which side of that I'm on because I think that the best legislation is bipartisan. But either way, we only saw one side. So I just wonder why you continue to use aggression instead of open acceptance. That way both sides want to come.
I will say this, if it seems that me talking about the facts is aggressive, I apologize.
No, not the facts.
It's not to be- I mean, okay, well, again, perception is a powerful thing, it clearly is. But I will say this, you raise a question, and I'm curious about something, based on what you've said and what others in this room may have experienced. How many people in this room grew up below the poverty level? About 20%, 25%. So did I, way below the poverty level. I never had any access to health care my entire life. I was an active duty Army officer, probably about your age, before I had any access to the health care system. So I know this world. So again, assumptions that I don't have a clue what people go through. I spent the first half of my life, you're not, but other people have made assumptions that I think are not necessarily appropriate. And I applaud you for what you're doing, which is trying, A, to engage people, B, to find bipartisan solutions to things, and to find solutions for people who truly need an opportunity. And I truly appreciate you doing it, because this was a passion of mine when I was your age, and trying to find a path forward. The American dream is a real thing. It really is. And for someone like you or someone like me to be able to be given a different lot in life than what we were maybe born into or circumstances dealt us is possible in America. But it does take people like you being engaged in helping encourage other people to do it. So I applaud you for it. I really do. And the fact that you're engaged and you vote, good. Vote wisely. I have no doubt that you will. You seem to be fairly informed. These things are important. They really are. There was a question back here. Yes, ma'am, and then sir.
My name is Rita Starr. I'm in the hospitality industry, and when you ran for governor, you alluded to a trash can on the hill in Frankfurt and how you wanted to clean up the state. Well, our roadways have not been mowed for weeks and months. And I'd like to know what the problem is, why it's a safety issue as well as hospitality issue.
I mean, with anything, whether it's the condition of a rest stop, but what you're referring to is that in my first State of the Commonwealth address, I talked about the overlooking the Capitol, that had one broken garbage can, the other one had the top missing, that the wall was broken, that the kudzu and other vines had grown over the dead trees. You couldn't even see the Capitol. It actually isn't. I would encourage you to go by there. It does look better, but the point is
Notice when you came into Richmond, how it looked.
that and every other thing, including the highways, including the quality of the equipment of our law enforcement officers, the newness of the textbooks in our classroom, whether or not a pothole gets fixed or not. 100% of these things, whether a highway gets mowed with whatever level of frequency, 100% of these things, 100% is paid for with taxpayer money. And when there's not enough of it, something gives, because every dollar that goes to one of those things or something else doesn't go to something else. It would be awesome. We could, in fact, cut everything more frequently, but guess what? We don't get new cruisers for your local law enforcement or state police. We don't get new textbooks. We don't, something gives somewhere. The reality is we are doing more with less, and we're doing this because we are the first administration that has ever funded the pension system, ever. I put more than $3 billion. Do you think I could cut a lot of grass with $3 billion? Of course. If I had done what every previous administration did, I'd cut the grass, giving everyone the impression that all was good, while underfunding the very pension system that people like those in this room, like your mother, like my grandmother, and other people depended on for their retirement. I'm not blowing smoke and pretending it's good with clean-cut grass. I'm funding things that matter. You should expect that of government. Believe me, if I didn't put $3 billion into the pension system, if I'd even just put $2 billion in, I'd have still done more than anyone before me ever did. Still wouldn't have funded it enough, though. And think how much grass I could cut with $1 billion. I could cut it every other day. I could cut it every day. Cut it every hour. The reality, of course it doesn't. That's my point. So everything comes at a cost. And we don't have the money that we have been led to believe that we have, or that we wish we have. We don't. So if there's a finite,
$75,000.
if there's a finite amount of money,
So if you cut back on that, you have money to put into the fund.
listen, I can understand again, we talked about this, maybe it matters, maybe it doesn't, folks. But I will say this. If I pay a person $375,000 because that's what it takes to get them to be here, and that person can save that much every 2 weeks for the state of Kentucky, is that a good investment or not?
Can you prove that you can save that much every 2
He
weeks?
has already saved, so yes, millions and millions
Then
and
why can't
millions
we
of
fund the
dollars
teacher
already.
fund if you saved us millions and millions?
We are. We've put $3 billion just
Then
this
why can't we
past
cut
year.
the grass?
Because again, you understand this, it's because at the end of the day, you can't spend it on everything, can you? Every
No,
dollar
so
you
you ought to
save.
cut it out of $375,000 and cut the grass.
And
And
so-
do other things that are more important.
And if you brought a person in here for, let's say that like the last person that was in this job was making, say, $175,000, I forget what it was, something like that, $175,000 a year. But that person was spending over $1 million a year to get people to write program in Fortran and COBOL, many multiples. These people were being paid to do something that's obsolete. We were paying, some of you who've ever bought a software license, if you buy a software license, you pay X amount for the first 10 users, and then it goes down after that. This state was buying the same piece of software from the same vendor 10, 15, 20 different times, every time 10 licenses to start. Nobody thought, let's consolidate that and pay 10 for the state of Kentucky and then get a discount after that. This individual that people are upset about had the ability that previous people in that role did not have. They didn't have the ability or they didn't care. I don't know which it was. But the point is, we had mainframe computers being programmed with programs that are obsolete. People paying ridiculous amounts of money, $500 to $600 million a year in IT for the state. Yes, we're big, but we are wasting tens and tens of millions of dollars a year conservatively. This individual, in a matter of less than a year, has already saved millions and millions of dollars. Is that a lot of money? Yes. It's more than twice what I make. It's a lot of money that he makes, no question about it. But in terms of the value that he brings to Kentucky, we are getting a bargain. It may not feel like it, but I'm telling you, he has skills and knowledge that I don't have, that no other person in this room has.
Right, and he got it from his education, correct?
Again, he got it from life experience and education, no question.
May I say something?
Yes.
You like scenarios,
And then I also
Okay.
want to get
but
this.
you like these scenarios. So what would happen if you were to invest in education and support the incoming teachers with like the same, with a responsible pension system, like what we have, encourage them to come, encourage their further education, and then that's going to produce more educated people within the Commonwealth and more educated people around, and thus, wow, we'll increase our taxes.
So you would hope that I would do exactly what I'm doing?
No,
Oh.
because what you're doing is not that.
It is. I mean,
No.
the head of the KA just said that I'm the only governor she's
Yes,
ever
you
been
did
under
fund
that
it.
has funded.
However, with
No,
the
that's
pension
exactly
bill-
what you
no,
just
the
gave
pension
me
bill
in
that's
this
coming
scenario.
through, you're trying to cut incoming teachers. You said you think that it was up to us to have, or it was up to the legislator to decide for people who aren't coming in, or who don't work for the state yet, for teachers who don't work for the state yet, so you're gonna change you want to change the medical contract. That's making incoming teachers who are in college, studying education, wanting to become teachers, you're making it less and less enticing for them, thus driving down our education production.
But in this scenario that you gave, you talked about the pension system. The pension system will fail if we keep promising people what it can't even support right now. If we promise people in the future, you don't have to agree. But again, we are funding it, but even that funding alone is not enough. All this is done is...
The BFM report said that on page 50, if you just fund it at the allocated amount, it will be solvent within like 4 years.
Okay, they've been saying that for the last 30 years. It has done what exactly?
No, it's the report you commissioned, the BFM.
Exactly. The same actuaries have been saying these days for a long time. It isn't just a function.
So you waste money on those guys, right?
It isn't funding alone. If you read that study, that very same study says that the funding is 16%. We talked about that a moment ago. It's 16 of the 100% of underfunding status. That funding alone isn't going to be enough. It's not. It can't be.
That's not what this report, page 50 says.
I would encourage you to
if
read
the
the whole
recommended
report.
employer contribution levels are fully achieved in fiscal year 2019 and thereafter, and assets are earned, revised asset allocation 6% per year or higher, the plan is projected to remain solvent.
Okay, solvent and actually funded are two very different things. Very different. Again, we could have a long conversation about it. In other words, it won't fail.
This is Kevin President.
It won't fail.
But
But it failing or not failing and it actually being able to fulfill the promises are two very, very different things. They really are. You had a question in the back, sir.
I do, sir. You know you knew who the largest employer was in Harrison County. You cited that. Do you know who the two biggest employers in Madison County are? And do you know how your actions are impacting them?
The public education system, I know, is the largest one in Madison County. I don't know who the second is. I would guess it's another public plan.
It's Eastern Kentucky University and the county school system. And how are your actions impacting those two institutions?
We're giving those two institutions better certainty that all their workers and retirees will actually get a pension. So that's what our actions are doing. We're also, this is the
How's
first
it serving the
administration.
students in those two areas?
You've lived in this state, I guess, for a fair amount of time. Do you remember
I've
when
lived
the
in this
lottery?
town and this county for 7
Do you remember when the lottery came in? What was it we promised people would be the proceeds of the lottery would go to what? Education. I'm the only governor you've ever had that has put 100% of that money to education. The only one. You can say, if you don't care about that, you should, because previous governors have swept that money, have told you that they're going to give it to education, and they swept that money and paid other things with it. Again, to make people feel good, but lying to people about what that purpose of that money is. I'm also the only governor, for those of you that are benefiting from CLEF, which is for law enforcement people who take POP certified training on an annual basis. They go and take additional training to be able to protect us. And you have seen in this community, in very recent years, the impact of people that are willing to put their lives on the line. And so let me finish this, sir. I'm the first governor in 21 years to give these guys any kind of an increase in POP certification raises, even though that money, the previous governor in 8 years, took $117 million out of their POP certified money, instead of giving them a raise, and swept it into other things. I am the only governor
I'm talking to those people
that I've never swept the lottery money, and I never will. I've never swept the CLEF funds, and I never will. You have more money going right now, more money per pupil and more in absolute dollars than has ever gone into K through 12 spending in the history of Kentucky.
How about Eastern Kentucky University?
It isn't a lie. It's an absolute fact.
How's Eastern
It's an
Kentucky
absolute
University?
fact. There is more money going into K through 12 education per pupil and in absolute numbers than ever in the history of Kentucky.
Are you taking
Look it
inflation
up.
into account?
All of it. Take a look at it. These are, so you asked, what do I think the impact is? We're putting more money into education than ever in the history
We
of
have
this
lost
state.
96 jobs at EKU,
There may
96
be.
jobs.
Yes.
Because of a budget that you signed off on.
Again, but understand this, people lose jobs all the time in different places, and sometimes they do. What the decision made by the administration and the board to cut jobs is the decision they made based on the amount of monies that they had to allocate. And while there may be people losing jobs in some
Because of
places,
the allocation that you approved.
there's people being hired in other places. The absolute money to post-secondary education has gone down every year for the last 12 years, I believe, in Kentucky.
Which causes an increase in tuition, which as you
It's one
stated
of
to
the
the college student, every student of my generation is crippled with student debt. the tuition is, the higher the student debt.
I have 3 kids that went to college, they all paid for their own. They all have masters, they're professionals. I've got a nurse, I've got a daughter that works in the industry in Lexington that makes quite a bit of money. And my son has 2 different masters, and he paid for his own. They all did. They got to figure out their own way.
Probably
Because we couldn't do it, and they did, they did the scholarships, they didn't get any state money.
I go without my medication to pay for my college.
Yes, sir.
That's crazy.
I know you're about to run out of time, but I wanted to bring up another thing. You brought something up a minute ago about 1% of Medicaid dollars go towards behavioral health.
Historically, that's been
Yeah,
the case.
I don't know if you remember or not. That's what I did. So alcohol and drug treatment and behavioral health, and trying to figure out a way to mainstream the process of getting approved through the MCOs to provide a quality treatment program.
This is one of the things in this 1115 waiver that we put out there, is we've asked the federal government, and it's a shame that we have to play Mother May I as often as we do with our own money, because Medicaid dollars are federal dollars that come to us, but it's our own money. We send it to Washington, some of it comes back to us with lots of strings attached and rules. So we've had to ask for an exemption to do exactly what you're asking for. For us as a state to be able to spend some of this specifically, right now for Medicaid, we can't invest this money into treatment the way that we would need and want to, because addiction is an absolutely direct correlation to mental health and behavioral health issues. It is. Not 100% of the time, but in the vast, vast majority of times, as you know. And so even things like getting the ability to have more than 16 beds in one facility open to people who need treatment. These things right now we cannot by federal law do. So we've asked for exemptions from the federal government for that, for how we can use money. And I was on a call last night with the Secretary of HHS, Alex Azar, with the White House, specifically talking about this. And just today, there was an announcement made about another $1.5 billion being disseminated nationally, tens of millions of which are coming to Kentucky, specifically to allow us to deal with the opioid crisis, which is part of what's crossing your path. So there are some monies coming, but more important than the monies are the rules by which we can or cannot operate. And our ability to be able to do this. I would encourage people real quickly, if you think of this or write it down, helpkynow.org. If you know anybody wrestling with addiction, helpkynow.org. Encourage them to check it out, because now you can get a phone number. It's 833-8KY-HELP. I believe 833-8KY-HELP is the toll-free number. You'll get a live person that can point people to someone like you. Because the point is, there may be somebody in a nearby county who doesn't even know that your facility exists. They may call someone they know, they go, sorry, we're full. Now we have the ability to connect people all over the state, even if it may be just the next county over. So a lot is starting to change, but we're asking the federal government to give us more ability. None of these things, let me say this, and again, time is, I don't know, I think we're 30 minutes beyond where we thought we'd be, but I don't want to shortchange you. Okay, let me say this. How many other people have a question? Okay, we'll try to do this super quick. All right, did you have a question? You did, okay, go ahead, because you've been...
So I'm just trying to understand, in the beginning you were talking about trying to cut taxes because we're competing with other states, we want to bring people in, and I'm just trying to
I
understand.
didn't talk about cutting taxes. I talked about making our environment more business-friendly through cutting regulation, through a tax environment that's modernized, where in essence we have lower taxes but on a broader base, so that we actually are more competitive to other states. So it does matter, we do, but at the end of the day, we need more money. All the things we're talking about require more money, which means somebody somewhere in this state is paying taxes. That's where it comes from. So it isn't, don't go out of here thinking that the magic solution is that everybody pays less and somehow we have more money. It's not.
So he got stabbed in the back, basically, so other people could get taxes cut, and I'm trying to understand the math a little bit of how it would work. And I just
The
want
key
to
is
say,
we have
as a
to-
taxpayer, I would be willing to pay more to support our public schools, to keep the grass mowed, to do all these things, like.
You believe in public education?
I do, I'm a product of public education, I believe in it. I think it's ridiculous that higher education has become as expensive as it is. You know, it's great that some people are, I work at Berea College,
again, we could have a long conversation in short version. Those of us that went to school more than 30 years ago, say at college, remember what your dorm room was like. There are very few kids on college campus right now, in any college, that are not going to have a tremendous drop in their quality of life when they walk out that door into the real world. Their rooms, their student lounges, the recliners, the cappuccino makers, the big screen TVs, the amenities, it's awesome. But guess what? That's where the money's going. I'm telling you that, and unfortunately, it becomes this sort of for parents and students alike. They want that. But guess what? It comes at a cost, and it comes at the cost of education.
That's unfortunate.
It is, and so sadly, so it's been driven by sort of an arms war to have the best and brightest. And so these things have been part of it, but you're right, the cost of education isn't even remotely in line with the value that people are getting out of it, because so much isn't going into the education. And so who hasn't gotten big increases during that time? Teachers. Teachers haven't. The amount that's being spent on the actual education has not. But facilities and extracurricular programs and athletic departments and things, this is where monies have been going, in salaries for coaches and things. And I'm not knocking all that, but all of these things come at a cost. And every dollar that goes into these things is a dollar not going into some of these other things we want. So your point